The river remembered before she did. It pressed its slow brown palm against the shore and left a damp signature on the cedar roots, whispering a name that most mouths on the plantation dared not form, Lilia. She rose in the pre-dawn chill, damp hem clinging to her ankles, listening to the marsh birds argue with the fog. A tobacco field sighed behind the quarters like a body too long forced to breathe shallow. Far off, the big house kept its windows shut against the truth, but truth slid under doors. It seeped through boards like river light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Lilia kept her eyes on her hands. The world was safer when it believed your gaze had no anchor. She set her basket on the plank table and began to peel the river potatoes she had fetched by moon, the blade whispering in patient arcs. In the corner of the quarters, a girl coughed, soft as a guilty thought. The fire caught and then steadied. Lilia's fingers worked without asking permission from fear. The fear was always there, sour as oak smoke, thin as splinter dust, and it did not argue when she told it to wait its turn. On the eastern shore of Maryland the winter came sideways, raining more than freezing, and the plantation wore damp like a second skin. The main house sat on a scrape of hill that had once been a Lenape burial place, the old people said, though no one in the big house believed anything they could not tax. The fields inched down toward the river in thin green combs. At low tide the marsh opened its ribs and let her pass to the small skiff no one counted in the ledger. That boat was a secret as stubborn and ordinary as a scar. Lilia did not own that skiff any more than she owned her name. Ownership here was a word that pretended it could turn breath into coin, and hands into tools, and children into cattle. But on the river, ownership thinned out. The current held her, not as property but as fact. She used a pole more than oars, standing and leaning into the slow push. In fog the creek bit its lip and said nothing. Her ears did the seeing, the slap of water on reeds, the gull's cross cry, the far clatter of a rail cart at the mill. On nights when the moon grew thin and hard as a scythe, she slipped down to the skiff and drifted along the banks until the tide mended itself. She listened to the river's grammar. She read it. Reading was a crime she wore the way she wore her hair, flat when watched, alive when alone. A torn almanac had taught her numbers and a hymnal had lent her letters. She'd found both in the kitchen loft where the cook, old Mira, stored broken things that still had a voice, chipped crockery, cracked ladles, a broom whose handle was straight as justice. Lilia learned the alphabet by listening to Mira sing and matching the tall black shapes to the breath between the notes. When Mira caught her mouthing the letters, the old woman looked away, then looked back hard, and said, "If words are whips, then learn how to hold the handle." Her other teacher was the cooper's shed. Barrels spoke in fractions and compass arcs. Mr. Teague, a white man the big house called a contractor but who was poor enough to be cruel, traced chalk marks and made her sweep the floor. She watched his hands. He clicked his tongue at her for being slow when she stepped between the staves and fetched the iron hoops. But she noticed how he measured with his thumb when the rule was missing, how he bent wood with heat and patience. He never knew she was learning. He never knew that at night she resketched his arcs with a burnt stick on the back of the quarters and practiced the knot that cinched the hoop and the stave into something sealed against the thirst of the world. There was a ledger in the study of the big house in which his name appeared more often than any man should. Lilia had seen that ledger once, just long enough to prove to herself it needed proof. She stood in the doorway delivering a covered dish and watched the man beneath the portrait of his own father dip a quill into black blood and write himself into everyone's cell. He was a man who loved numbers because they obeyed him, and mouths because they could be quieted, and the river because it pretended to carry away what it could not cleanse. They called him Asa Whitford, though his first name in the quarters was not a name but a warning, like smoke, like thunder. Asa owned the deed to the land and the bodies on it, but he had also signed a more private ledger, one he kept inside his bones, where the columns did not add up to profits so much as to claim. He had eyes that were the color of the river at dusk, not because they were beautiful but because they told you less and less the longer you looked. Lilia had his eyes. It was old Mira who said it out loud first, when Lilia was 12 and the mirror of the cookhouse kettle held back the steam long enough to show her face. "You got the Whitford dusk in your gaze, Mira murmured without looking up, cutting biscuits with a tin ring and laying them on the pan like a mother setting down newborns. Some men plant crops everywhere they go. Some plant themselves inside people and call it destiny. She spoke so low even the fire pretended not to hear. Lilia had learned to inhabit a quiet so deep it had corners. In those corners she put tools she might need later, numbers, knots, songs, maps. She put her breath there, too, when the big house remembered her. Memory, like ownership, traveled in one direction if you let it. She taught her own memory to move both ways. The first test of that training came the winter a baby was born who looked like the inside of her own wrist. The mother, Tansy, was 16 and had laughter that she had learned to hide behind her teeth. Those who dared speak the truth called the baby a Whitford out of both sides of their mouth, spitting and swallowing at once. Lilia watched Asa pass by the quarters 2 days after the birth, his face doing the kind of stillness that meant he believed he had taught the world how to be a mirror. He did not look up at the small window where Lilia stood. He did not need to. The river knew, the women knew, the ledger knew, the child's wrists knew. That was the year the marsh froze in a skin that broke if you held your breath wrong. Lilia mended nets with her back against the smokehouse wall, pinned bones of fish catching in the weave. She ran her fingers over the knots and thought of how the net did not argue about what entered it. It was a tool. It obeyed the hands that made it. At night, in the skiff, she practiced a different knot, the one that joined rope to ring hard enough to hold a boat against an impatient tide. The ring in her practice was the big iron staple at the landing, sunk into the piling. With the right knot and timing, a boat could appear to sit still while the river tried to drag it north or south, hungry and indifferent. Lilia liked the honesty of the iron. It did not pretend to be your father. Yellow iris would push up in the marsh by spring. Before that day, a winter courier brought an old woman to the quarters in a cart with no mark of the Whitford brand. She was all bone and clear eyes under a shawl that had known salt and prayer. People called her Aunt Bet by sundown, which meant she had said 3 true things before anyone asked her name. The first true thing was a warning: dreams bite if you feed them meat. The second was a gift, a pocket full of dried alum that sweetened well water gone metallic. And the third was a question asked like a statement: you got letters in you, child. Lilia did not answer at first. Aunt Bet sat with Mira and let the fire do its old remembering. Later, when the quarters were a quilt of sleep, Aunt Bet found Lilia under the eaves with her burnt stick in her shapes. She did not praise. Praise is a kind of ownership if given wrong. She asked Lilia to read the side of a crate the cart had carried: molasses, Port of Baltimore. Lilia read it out of the corner of her mouth, the way one says grace when men who do not believe are listening. You know what a ledger is for? Aunt Bet asked. To make truth pick a side, Lilia said, surprised to hear herself. Aunt Bet smiled with only one half of her face. Sometimes it's to make numbers lie without getting caught. But if you can read a ledger, you can also write a map. What kind? The kind that looks like a list of barrels. Or a recipe. Or the stitches in a hem. Lilia would later understand that almost everything Aunt Bet said had 2 handles. You could carry it either way, depending on which road you needed to take. The road they needed began as a whisper about a man who had lost a son in a flood and decided to stand in the river every new moon to show grief how to tire itself out. It continued as a list of extra flour that old Mira ordered and a second list of nails the cooper did not know were missing. It grew into a pattern of nights when the mill's wheel was louder than its work, and into a habit of sending certain children to gather mussels from the far bend where the marsh cut itself with a thin creek not on Ace's maps. A road like that does not look like a road until you've walked it twice. There were 2 kinds of time on Whitford land: the time in the field and the time in the house. Field time had chores and sun and call and response. House time had silences and closed doors and a different clock. Lilia kept both times in her body the way a river keeps both tide and dam in its memory. On the days when the big house signaled for her to sew, she went with her eyes low and her mind high, measuring cloth and people. She was good at seams. She could make a hem disappear into itself. She could also make a pocket where no pocket should be. A dress that looked like obedience could carry a letter against the ribs better than a Bible could protect a lie. Aunt Bet began bringing her scraps that did not match any dress in the quarters. The cloth was good, the thread was strong. Lilia learned to stitch left-handed so that anyone watching from the doorway would think they were seeing all she could do. Right-handed, she embroidered a language only certain women could read. 3 short stitches and a long one, 3rd creak, long bend. A row of invisible knots near a cuff, for men, don't count the boy. She tried not to let the pride of cleverness outgrow the caution that kept it alive. Meanwhile, Ace's house began to swell with a different kind of preparation. A cousin from Annapolis had taken a federal post, and men like Asa loved to gather other men's air in their lungs and call it influence. Notes came on cream paper. Guests arrived and left traces of perfumed soap in the washbasins. When Lilia was called up to measure windows for new curtains, she stood very straight on the house stool and felt the draft. It was not only winter sliding its slim hand under the sash. It was a restlessness the big house tried to name improvement. She measured, and thought of how some improvements were just new ways to forget old sins. The door to the study stood partway shut. She heard the sound a quill makes when a man leans too hard on it. A voice said, "You'll have to reclassify the debt. If the price shifts in Baltimore again, we want to be in front of it." Another voice answered, "I'm always in front." The quill snapped. Lilia did not look toward the study, she looked toward the window where her fingers had just laid a cotton tape against the trim. She imagined the snapped quill's sharp end shed a droplet of ink like a black tear. She imagined that tear landing on the ledger where all names flattened and lined up to offer their throats to arithmetic. The study door opened. Asa crossed into the hall with a piece of quill tucked behind his ear like a farmer's straw. He did not look up at her immediately. When he did, his eyes paused at her hands as if they were tools left out in the rain. "You'll take the back stair," he said. "No need to scuff the mane." His voice pretended to be gentle, the way a snake pretends to be a rope until you reach for it. "Yes, sir," Lilia said, the syllables lying down flat like boards. But he did not move on. He set a hand against the wall near her shoulder and studied the tape in her fingers. "Did Mara teach you numbers?" he asked. She felt the floor tilt, just a hair. "I count stitches," she said, which was true. He reached for the tape and let it slip through his fingers. "Useful," he murmured. "Useful is a kind of pretty." He stepped back then, toward the study, as if the house had reeled him in on a line. Back in the quarters, Lilia washed her hands until the line of her lifeline rose clean from her palm again. She did not tell Aunt Bet what Asa had said. Naming danger is a way of waking it up. Aunt Bet was busy making a salve out of pine rosin and hog fat for a boy whose ankle had been mistrusted by a wheel. "Listen to me," she said without looking up. "Some men come at you with a hammer. Some come with a mirror. The mirror is worse. How do you break it without bleeding?" Lilia asked. "You don't," Aunt Bet said. "You choose where to bleed, and you hide that blood in the part of you the man thinks he owns." Spring climbed out of the river with mud on its knees. The iris opened their yellow mouths. The tide ran higher on certain moons, as if the ocean itself had taken an interest in the eastern shore. The small skiff acquired a second scull hidden under the plank seat. The cooper's shed grew a corner where missing nails lived 2 days before the barrel counts. A child carried a hem in the wrong key to the wrong ear and learned the value of silence. Lilia's seams grew braver. There was a night when Tansy, the girl with the laughter behind her teeth, found Lilia by the landing. Tansy was holding the child in a shawl, the baby's breath warm against her collarbone. Moonlight made a flat lake of the river. "He says the boy will be moved," Tansy said without saying who he was. "He says people in the city pay more for boys who don't cry." Lilia looked at the river, which never said what if, only when and how. "Not yet," Lilia said, though the plan in her chest had been asking for its boots for weeks. "Aunt Bet says the road has to be walked twice. We've got one path but not the recross. He'll sell him." Tansy's voice was a held breath that finally let go. Lilia did not touch her, because if she touched her the truth would become a scream. "I'll sew a thing," she said instead. for his wrist. It was an ordinary idea holding an extraordinary edge. Lilia had seen the traders cut tiny slits inside the sleeves of jackets they planned to resell, to hide coins that counted as taxes paid. She made a cuff for the baby that looked like a baby's cuff. Inside it she stitched a ribbon of paper, thin as an onion skin, its letters smaller than a fly's shadow, a name, a place upriver, a sign that would cause Aunt Bet's cousin to claim a boy who did not look like him and call it the Lord's work. Lilia wrote the letters with a goose quill cut so fine it hardly displaced the air. Her hand shook only once. The baby kept his cuff. Asa counted barrels and guests. The big house polished itself until it looked like it had swallowed lightning. Men arrived with city dust on their boots and women rode in on the fumes of expensive soap. Music came and pinned itself to the dining room like a moth that didn't know it was being displayed. Mira cooked a ham that had been reminded twice not to be salted the way the Chesapeake is. Lilia served without being seen, invisibility fitted as neatly as a bodice. The study door stood shut. Somewhere in the house a ledger lay with its breath held. She was returning from the pantry with a fresh cloth when she heard a sound that stirred her body before her mind agreed. A child's cry, not the baby's, older, one of the Carter girls who dusted the hall banister. The cry was swallowed quickly in the heavy carpet of the parlor. Lilia kept walking. She kept walking past the parlor to the back staircase where the dust was honest. She kept walking until she reached the second landing where the air lay still because men thought power made breezes unnecessary. She resisted the urge to turn right, the line of rooms where doors knew her by name, and turned left, into the narrow corridor that ended at the study's second door. The second door was for servants and secrets. It was unlatched. Inside, a candle stub dared the dark, and the ledger on the desk shone like a flat river seen from a high bank. Lilia took one step, enough to take in the angle of the quill, the careful blotter, the edge of the pages, and the small iron safe pushed back from the desk as if it had been scolded for overheating. She took another step. She closed the door with a breath. She crossed the floor the way a seam crosses from hem to skirt, deliberate, hidden, anchoring. She set the fresh cloth down as if delivering bread. She put her hand on the ledger and felt how a book is both a mouth and a grave. She did not open it. She slid the ledger, just a finger's width, until the page edge kissed candlelight. She needed only the top lines. Malden barrel count. Choptank ferry fees. Tansy, no, not a name, girl, 16, light. Babies reduced to units, paid for in the language of oats and molasses. Her mouth tasted like iron. She willed her hand not to tremble and fished in her sleeve for the scrap of onion paper she had cut hours before. Not the baby's map, that was sewn and beyond reach now, but another map, the kind Aunt Bet said a woman must always have, the kind with a destination named shame and a distance measured in men's faces. She copied 3 columns of figures and 1 column of initials. Not names, Asa liked to pretend he was decent. Initials broke the world into crumbs he could hold in his mouth without choking. Lilia wrote them down with a pencil stub wrapped in twine, A.W., J.K., H.H. The last of these made her breath heave once, like a river that has to swallow a stump it cannot move around. H.H. was the man from town who kept the jail. That meant if the road led to town, the road led into another throat. The door didn't move. The house held its breath with her. When she finished she slid the ledger back, lifted the fresh cloth, and left the room by way of its second silence. The music below had grown louder, the way music does when anyone who hates quiet grows afraid. Aunt Bet met Lilia at the bottom step with a tray full of cups. "You walked a road," the old woman said without looking up. "Now we have to choose whether to take the river to it or ask it to come to us." "That's safe," Lilia murmured. "Is there a tool that opens the inside out?" "Every safe thinks it's a church," Aunt Bet said. "But most are only boxes that haven't met the right question. Can your cooper's hands ask it?" Lilia thought of the hoops that cinched warm staves and how the iron softened with heat. She thought of how the skiff's ring did not care who tied to it, only how well the knot held. "Maybe," she said. "But I suspect the key is a person, not a thing." That night the guests left glitter in the candles like snow that had lost its mind. Mira scrubbed the boards with a brush that had outlived 3 handles. Asa stood in the doorway and told the room good work as if he had lifted a finger to earn it. His eyes passed over Lilia and paused with a kind of interest that made a dog in the yard growl without knowing why. "Stay," he said to Lilia when Mira told her to go. He waited until the others had gone. "You have a steady hand," he said. "Did you know?" She kept her face like cooled ash. "Mira praises me enough for 2, she said. "Come to the study," he said, as if he were offering a plate. The river inside her tried to climb the bank. She went because field time and house time argued and house time won when your body was the border. The study smelled like paper and smoke and a man trying to use both to buy absolution. Asa went behind the desk and sat the way a king might sit if he had never learned to stand like anyone else. "Hold the candle," he said. "I don't want to blot the page." She lifted the candle in its brass stand. Light made a small stage of the ledger. She watched his hands move, the quill whispering, the way he paused at the edge of a sum while his mind paid a debt to himself. He wrote until the candle guttered and flinched. He did not look up. "Closer," he said. She stepped as close as the room would let her without becoming part of the furniture. His sleeve brushed her wrist when he reached to tap the sand across wet ink. Her pulse made a small drumbeat against her skin. He heard it. He put down the quill and looked at her not as a man looks at a person but as a man looks at a boundary he has decided to move. "Your mother taught you to be quiet," he said. "But blood will talk. It always does." He lifted his hand as if to tap her wrist where the pulse was arguing with the candlelight. The room held still so carefully that the flame stopped showing its shoulders. Outside, the river spoke in the language of frogs. "Sir," she said, the word folded so tightly it made a square in her mouth. He smiled, not with his mouth but with his certainty. "I can make life better for you," he began, the way a hunter begins a story to a deer. "There are rooms you've never seen." "I've seen them," she said before she decided to say it. "I measured them." His head cocked. For a heartbeat the ledger did not know whether to be a book or a blade. He stood, very slowly, so the chair did not complain. He took the candle from her. "Go," he said finally, voice smooth as cloth cut on the bias. "We will speak again." On the stair, her breath returned like a bird that had been trapped inside a chimney. She went out to the yard and rinsed her hands in the barrel until the cold stung her bones quiet. Aunt Bet was there, shadow slipped loose from the smokehouse. Did he lay claim? "Not with his hands," Lilia said. "Claims have many fingers," Aunt Bet said. "We will need many knives." Knives, in the Eastern Shore sense, were not always metal. Some were words tied to witnesses. Some were numbers set loose on paper like dogs. Some were plants whose roots bled in water until the water remembered a man's face and did not forgive it. Lilia began gathering all 3. She sewed more cuffs. She reinforced the bottom of the skiff with 2 fresh ribs and hid a roll of thin chain in the stern locker. She moved coins the way you move light in a mirror, so it lit what you needed and not what you didn't. She listened to the jailer's name whispered under the floorboards of town. She memorized the pattern of the safe's 4 key notches by the way Ace's hand turned when he put the iron to it: quarter turn, pause, quarter, full. You can learn a song by watching lips, you can learn a lock by watching wrists. One evening a storm crept out of the marsh on cat feet and then remembered it was born of an ocean. The sky pulled its seam and opened. Rain came down like the river remembering how to fall. Mira moved the children into the cookhouse and closed the shutters with a laugh that dared the wind to argue. Aunt Bet sat with her back to the hearth and hummed a tune with no notes. Lilia went out into the rain because the river had sent her a word, now. At the landing the skiff lifted and dropped against the piling like a heart proud of itself. The staples gleamed. She put her shoulder into the rope and made the knot that meant "I will not go unless I choose it." She set her jaw and pushed off. The rain made the surface of the creek look like skin about to speak. She pulled into the channel and then stowed the pole and took the oars, not because she needed them to move but because a woman sometimes needs to hear her own arms tell her they will carry her. She rode to the far bend where the cattails made a cathedral and paused under the curve of an old willow that leaned the way an exhausted woman leans against a brief kindness. She pulled a small bundle from under the stern seat, iron filings wrapped in paper, a length of thin chain, a short bar of beeswax, and a key she had poured 2 days prior from tallow in a mold she made in the Cooper's sand while Mr. Teague sent a boy to town for rum. It wasn't a key, not yet, it wasn't even a sin. It was a question shaped like an answer. She pressed the filings into the wax, turning it in her fingers until its teeth held their mouths right. She wrapped the chain around her wrist and lowered her hand into the river until the cold taught her the difference between fear and caution again. The chain swung, clicked soft against the skiff. In the rain, under the willow, the river told her a small story about iron learning to remember. She listened. What she planned was not lightning. It was carpentry. It was a joining of weight and angle and patience. The safe in Ace's study thought it belonged to him more than a rib belongs to a chest. But iron is older than ownership. With the right question in the right hands, it forgets who made it. That night the storm convinced even Asa to sit still. He drank with a man who had too much money to be from here and pretended to listen while checking numbers in his head like a clock that wanted applause. Lilia served once and then disappeared from the house like a thought you push away because it tells you the truth. She went by the back stair to the second door. The candle she carried had a narrow flame, the kind that doesn't broadcast its own importance. The safe waited at the desk's knee. She set the candle stub on a saucer and pressed her ear to the lock, not because it would tell her anything but because it would make her body quiet. The wax key met the iron. It pushed and turned and, for a moment, pretended to fail. She steadied her hand, felt the way the filings she had pressed into the wax tried to teach the lock its own childhood. She eased pressure when instinct wanted to force. The lock learned to remember. It opened, not loudly, not proudly, like a man recalling something someone else paid him to forget. Inside the safe, papers, of course. A small bag with the sound of coin. A pistol with a finish like a lie clean for church. She did not touch the gun. She lifted the papers and leafed until she met a document that held its spine differently than the rest. It was a bill of sale with no seller named, only a buyer, and Lilia's world shrank to the size of the ink that formed 3 words, issue of house. Under it, the date of her birth. She set her teeth into her lip until the skin remembered blood. Paper can make a life vanish or appear. This paper attempted both at once. It named her property and confessed her parentage, which is to say it baptized itself in theft and called it law. She slid the bill into her sleeve without thinking and then thought better and put it next to her heart because no house ever searches the place it claims it owns. Another page. Another ledger, this one a cousin to the big book on the desk, its figures meaner, its letters shyer. Here were names turned into initials that tried to leave a room without being seen. Here were sums that spoke the language of flesh and threat and river miles. Here, too, a list titled Quiet Matters. A pair of entries wore the shape of Tansy's life and the baby's cough, translated into code like I am hummed behind a door. She did not steal the second ledger. Theft can be loud even when it's silent. She copied what she could onto the onion skin with a pencil so short it stained her knuckles. She slid the safe closed and listened to the lock return to its belief in itself. She straightened the candle, lifted the tray she had brought as excuse, and left the room with a face that did not reflect. Back at the quarters Aunt Bet took the paper and held it over steam so the pencil lines sank into the fibers. We have a rope, she said. Now we need a tree and a crowd that believes in shade. What's the tree? Lilia asked. Not wood, Aunt Bet said. Law. City hands have to hold the thing that will catch him. Men like him planted the law. But sometimes the law turns back on its gardener when the river rises. City hands, Lilia repeated, tasting the iron in the word. H has the jail. H has a mother who can read, Aunt Bet said. The plan that grew had 3 roots. The first was a letter written in a hand that would not be believed to belong to a woman from the quarters, addressed to a minister who loved the sound of his own fairness and who had once, by accident, told the truth. The second was a map, the seamstress's language of stitches, stitched into a hem that would travel north with a peddler who thought he only sold needles and cloth but whose heart had a place in it that had not yet been priced. And the third was a scene that had to be staged at the river landing in sight of more eyes than fear could shut. To stage a scene you must trust your tools. Lilia trusted the skiff, the iron ring, the knot, the chain hidden beneath the stern seat. She trusted Myra's ability to bring men to a moment by feeding their hunger and making them grateful. She did not trust timing. Timing is a god no one can own. The night before the day she chose, Lilia sat by the river and asked the water to remember her without pity. "I am not asking for mercy," she whispered. "I am asking for work." The river licked the piling and said, "You will be tired when you are done." Dawn broke with a humility that felt like a dare. Mira sent her to the house with a basket of bread and a reason. Aunt Bet set herself at the cookhouse door and pretended to be old enough to be useless. Tansy kept the baby close enough that any hand would have to touch her first. The men whose boots liked to be counted walked the yard in 2s and 3s, smelling the day for profit. When Asa came out to the porch, his face wore the serenity of a ledger at 0. He lifted his chin at Lilia like a man acknowledging a well-made fence. "You," he said. "Fetch the key to the river store." The river store was the name he gave to the small shed near the landing where rope and tar and borrowed tools kept one another company. He did not carry its key, he liked other hands to bear the weight of his errands. Lilia went, as told, but she went the long way by the cooper's shed, where behind a stack of staves Mr. Teague kept a little box of his own that contained a file thin enough to travel with a breath. She slipped the file into her sleeve while his back remembered rum again. She crossed to the river store and opened it with the key from the hook hidden in the rafters like a bird that had given up flight for hiding. She did not take rope. She did not take tar. She took a small, heavy hook shaped like the question a man asks when he thinks he already owns the answer. She slid it into the skiff under the seat where the chain lay and set the oars as if she were only straightening the bedding for a nap. From the porch Asa watched the river as if it were a mirror he'd paid to flatter him. "I'll show a guest the landing," he announced, inventing generosity as he went. He stepped down with a city man 2 strides behind, a man with a hat that looked like it feared weather. Lilia took her place by the skiff with her eyes lowered to her hands. "Good wood," Asa said, nudging the skiff with his boot. "Even the small things are well kept on my land." He said my land as if the ground were flattered by his attention. "Take us out and back," he added, not quite a command, not quite permission. She set the oars in the locks and lowered her gaze to the grain of the wood. She could feel, through the soles of her feet, the notch in the stern seat where she had hidden the chain. She could feel, in the river light, the place where the current curled like hair behind the piling. She could tell when the city man shifted so his boots found purchase. She could tell when Asa's weight made the skiff remember its humility. The boat slid out. The river, generous with those who spoke to it correctly, offered a path across the current and back again as smooth as a hand smoothing a child's hair. Asa talked the way men talk when water makes them feel immortal, about yields, about rail spur gossip, about a plan to build a second mill if men could be convinced to believe in the first one harder. The city man made noises like silver spoons clicking. On the bank, Mira came to the door and shaded her brow. Aunt Bet settled herself on an overturned bucket like a stone that had decided to be a witness. Tansy stood near the cookhouse with the baby's cuff visible for precisely 2 breaths and then hidden. Midstream, a gull called the way a knife might sing if it loved the air. Lilia dipped one oar as if correcting a drift that did not exist. The skiff's stern brushed the piling's downstream edge. In that heartbeat, her right hand dropped to the seat, found the chain's tongue, and fed it to the water. The hook kissed iron. Chain took up slack. The skiff slowed as if the river had decided to remember a promise it had made to a different woman on a different day. Asa's voice hesitated. He looked down, because men who believe the earth obeys them always mistrust the moment it doesn't. The city man looked, too, and his hat, proud of itself, remembered to be afraid too late. The chain held. The current did the work. The skiff twisted just enough that the force of the river pinned its tail to the piling while the bow tried to go home. Lilia stood into it, as if startled, and let the oars skate useless in the locks. Asa reached out to steady himself against the gunwale and in doing so offered his wrist to the question the river had been waiting to ask. Lilia chose the voice in which she would speak for the rest of her life. Calm. Clear. A seamstress choosing a stitch. "Sir," she said. "There are rooms you haven't seen." She pulled the file from her sleeve. With 2 strokes she cut the line that pretended to tie the skiff to safety. The boat lurched. Asa grabbed for the piling, but the hook's chain tightened, jerking him forward so his balance and pride parted like combed hair. He fell to one knee, then both, the river licking at the boot that had nudged her boat and called it his. The city man shouted something that meant nothing in any language that mattered. Lilia reached for the iron ring with her left hand, the hand she had trained to sew a second story into a hem, and snapped the hidden link she had prepared days ago. The chain that held the skiff became the chain that chose a man. Asa's arm slipped into the loop she had laid open, the river closed it with a pull that did not ask permission. He looked up at her then and saw her as a person for perhaps the first time in his life. The ledger in his eyes flipped its pages. A cost appeared that had never been counted before. "Lilia," he said, making her name into a question and a property mark in the same breath. The river answered him. It surged, not enough to take him but enough to teach him his knees. His voice lost its sermon. He strained against the chain, making the sound a man makes when he finally meets a truth he cannot hire away. On the bank, people had begun to move without running. Aunt Bet stood, Mira set down her ladle, Tansy pressed the baby's cuff with 2 fingers, the way one checks a pulse and a secret at the same time. No one cried out. They had been quiet for years. They had been practicing for this. Lilia bent as if to help, and Asa, whose imagination had been trained by power to see only certain endings, thought she meant to lift him. She took his hand but not to lift, she took it to turn his palm up to the light and show him what was written there. The crease of his lifeline met the crease of hers the way 2 rivers meet, not as cousins, as collisions. "You planted yourself where God did not put you," she said, and her voice did not break. "Your hands have been a ledger. Today they balance." A shout came from the porch, a white woman's voice, the cousin from Annapolis, calling an order like a hymn that had lost all its vowels. Behind her, men scrambled in the language of boots and fear. The city man in the skiff tried to stand and found that water had its own opinion about courage. Asa pulled once more and the chain cut the breath in his arm into small rations. He spat a word that broke apart before it reached her. She did not lean back or forward. She held the oar with her left hand and the chain with her right and became a hinge. Then the river rose on a gust. The skiff bucked. The chain jerked. The hook, which had been a question for 3 nights and a promise for 1, decided it had heard enough answers. The sound of iron closing around a man's wrist is not loud. It is exact. It is the same sound a lock makes when it forgets who bought it. The current pulled. The skiff slammed against the piling and held, because the knot she had tied knew its job, because the chain she had forged had only one song, because the river had decided to be a judge who could not be bribed. Asa's body bowed like a palm in hurricane light. His breath came out in coins that sank. "Let him up," someone screamed from the bank, and the scream had a woman's fear and a man's habit braided into it. Lilia looked at the bank and saw not 1 crowd but 2, the people who had been his arithmetic and the people he called guests. She saw Tansy's eyes, wide like windows. She saw Aunt Bet's mouth, closed like a book that was not finished being written. "Witness," Aunt Bet said, not loud, and the word traveled across the water the way truth does when it has finally grown teeth. Lilia lifted her head and spoke to the river, to the crowd, to the house whose windows were pinched shut against a stink it made itself. "I name the debt," she said. "And I pay it with his weight." Behind her, beyond the bend, a second skiff appeared, 2 silhouettes bent to oars, the sign stitched into a cuff shining for only 1 heartbeat as sun knifed through cloud. The recross existed. The road had been walked twice. The minister's letter had found his vanity. H.H.'s mother had read what her son pretended not to see and set her lamp in the window like law-remembering paper. The peddler had not sold bravery for thread. Ace's knee slipped. Water took his hat. The chain sang. Lilia tightened her grip just enough to decide. And then, from the mill road, boots. Many boots. The kind that had never met a river they respected. The sheriff and 3 men in coats too fine for weather, H.H. himself with a paper in his hand like a shield and a gun in the other like a confession. The river did not stop for them. But time, in the house sense, leaned its shoulder in. By authority, H.H. began, his mouth learning the shape of a word he thought he owned. The current heaved. The chain bit. Ace's eyes found Lilia's, and in them she saw not repentance but recognition, the recognition of a man who has finally been forced to read the letters on a page he wrote himself. Lilia breathed. She loosened the oarlock with her left hand, feeling for the pin she had set loose by half a turn at dawn. The skiff trembled, wanting to be wild. The sheriff raised his gun. Aunt Bet lifted her hands. Mira cried, "Children," in a voice that meant scatter and gather at once. H.H. stepped onto the landing plank, paper raised like a white flag that didn't know it was a noose. Lilia pulled the pin. The oar jumped free and the skiff slewed, and the chain's promise tightened into a verdict, and the crowd on the bank surged, and the pistol's mouth opened, and the world held its breath on the lip of a single beat of the river's heart. And a shot cracked the air, flat and close, as the iron ring screamed against the piling and the chain went slack or taut, she could not tell which yet, while Ace's body heaved and the skiff pitched and the minister's letter burned like a small sun in H.H.'s hand. Just as the baby's cuff flashed once more in the open, a stitched star at a wrist too small to be counted, and the river raised itself to speak. And everything became the color of iron. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Iron. The word rang through Lilia's bones the way a bell pulls sound out of itself and hands it to everything that can shake. Smoke from the pistol curled into the damp air and thinned, ashamed to have been born. The chain trembled. Ace's groan came up through his teeth the way a root breaks the skin of dirt, slow, stubborn. The skiff shuddered, half freed by the slipping pin, half trapped by the river's grip. On the bank, the crowd bent forward like grain in a single wind. Lilia did not blink. The world would take blinking as permission to lie. She tested the chain with her wrist. The current tugged, deciding how much judgment one river could hold. H.H. stood on the landing with the paper curled in his fist, gun in the other hand smoking like a bad sermon. His hat sat wrong, as if it knew which way a man was leaning and refused to travel with him. "I said by authority," he barked again, voice made of courthouse dust. "And I answered," Lilia said, low but level. If the river had a mouth, it would have borrowed her tone. Witness. Aunt Bet stepped down off the bucket, bones the shape of truth. "Put away the thunderstick, boy," she told H.H., using a name old enough to make him 10 years old in front of strangers. "You don't want the law to hear its own echo." H.H. flinched. The sheriff, older, with a scar that no one mentioned, raised a hand the way a man gives a dog a second command. "Holster," he told H.H., "we don't have a body to point that at yet." Yet, Asa choked, water licking his chin as if tasting the hypocrisy on his collar. "Get me up." He tried to yank his wrist free and met iron that had learned its job from older iron. Lilia scanned the faces on the bank. Myra's eyes promised food and fury in equal portions if she called for them. Tansy had the baby tucked against her, cuff hidden again, but her jaw looked like a door that had chosen its hinges. Men from the quarters stood not behind but beside their women, hands open, palms forward, no weapons, only work-hardened truth. The city guest had gone silent, his hat wet and dignity wetter. "Sheriff," Lilia said without looking away from Asa. "You brought paper. Read it." The sheriff took the bill from H.H.'s hand. His eyes moved slower than the river, but not by much. He cleared his throat. "Writ from Judge Caraway in Cambridge. In the matter of suspected improprieties and unlawful commerce of persons, petitioned by Reverend Alton Wicks, sworn witness statements attached. His voice hesitated on improprieties, as if the word were too clean for what it had to hold. He went on. Seizure of ledgers and safes. Detain Mr. Asa Whitford if obstruction is found. A murmur ran through the bank like minnows. Reverend Alton Wicks himself stood beyond the sheriff, a man who loved fairness the way some men love mirrors, mostly for what it reflected on them. He looked pale from the river stink, but his chin tilted toward the paper like a rooster greeting daylight he didn't make. "Your hand in that?" Asa rasped at Lilia, face twisting as the chain worried his bones. "My hand was busy learning," she said. "Others wrote." He tried to laugh and choked on the river. The sheriff motioned to two deputies. "Get that chain off him," he ordered. "I'm not letting judgment drown a man when I haven't read the books." "No," H.H. snapped, stepping out onto the plank, eyes bright with sudden courage that smelled like Asa's money. "Let him feel it a bit." The sheriff turned a slow, heavy glance on H.H. "We're not your jailhouse, Howard," he said, and H.H. shrank half an inch under the sound of his given name. Aunt Bet let the quiet lengthen. Lilia felt the river choosing between mercy and memory. She thought of the bill of sale against her ribs, its ink like a bruise that spelled out blood. She thought of Tansy's baby cough, paper stitched into skin. She thought of Myra's hands, flour whitened from making suppers for men who calculated their own salvation. And then she thought of the plan's third route, the scene at the landing. "Scenes," Aunt Bet said, "are the same as traps. You make them, and then you wait to see who chooses to put their neck inside." "Sheriff," Lilia said, steady. "There's a key in the study safe. It opens more than one lock." "Study first," the sheriff agreed. He nodded to a deputy. "Go." The deputy ran. Lilia eased the tension against the chain, the least fraction, enough to keep the river from finishing what it had begun on its own. Asa coughed river into river. He closed his eyes with something like prayer on his face, except that prayer, when it's honest, softens a man. Whatever moved through Asa hardened him. When he opened his eyes, he looked past Lilia at the bank, at the big house, at every person the ledger had taught him to count, and saw a jury. "You think this changes what you are," he grated at Lilia, anger making him sound almost full of breath again. "It doesn't. Paper won't turn dogs into judges." "Dogs know more about justice than you do," Mira called from the door, voice mild as biscuits and sharp as the knife she used to cut them. Laughter ran quick and warm along the quarters line and then went still, respectful of the river's work. The deputy returned with a bundle, ledgers, the little safe's guts poured into his arms, keys clattering at his hip. The sheriff set them on a crate on the landing plank. He flipped the first ledger open and squinted at Asa through numbers. H.H. tried to look over his shoulder and got shouldered aside by Aunt Bet with a movement so small it felt like the wind. "Quiet matters," the sheriff read aloud, and the crowd shivered at the two words upright on paper that had lived flat in the shadows. He wet his thumb and turned a page. He found what Lilia had copied and what she had not dared to take and what she had not known to look for. He found initials that were not initials at all. When you tilted the page toward the light and saw the faint imprint of the pen's earlier pass, the ghost of a name that could not hide from paper's memory. "Asa Whitford," the sheriff said, voice flattening into work. "By this writ and by testimony plain and otherwise, I'm detaining you for," he paused, "for everything I can say and everything decent folks cannot." "Tie me to shore before you take your victory lap," Asa gasped. Lilia chose then, because choosing is the only power a body cannot own for you. She bent, worked the knot with fingers that remembered both barrels and hems, loosened the promise just enough to let air back into a man who had used too much of it. The chain slacked. Iron side. Asa sagged into the skiff, water sheeting off his coat. He coughed an ugly breath and braced to stand. When his boots found the plank, when the sheriff stepped in with handcuffs and a deputy reached for the chain, when H.H. finally remembered to feel fear of something other than losing a wage, when the crowd on the bank leaned forward to see what a man looks like with law on his wrists, then Asa's eyes cut sideways to Lilia, and she saw the thing that had always lived behind them, not doubt, not shame. Calculation. He lunged. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't clumsy. It was the reach of a man who had always found the lever in a room and used it. He yanked the chain toward him, using its slack as handhold, grabbed Lilia's forearm at wrist bone, and pulled with everything in him. Water took them both like a mother who has had enough of quarrels. Cold locked Lilia's chest. The world turned green-brown, loud with bubbles. The chain burned her skin where Ace's pull wrenched it across her forearm. She did not swallow. She did not thrash. The river had told her years ago what panic costs. She turned and followed the chain like a sentence back to its subject. Her fingers found iron, then rope, then Ace's sleeve, slick, hateful. He tried to use her like a step. She became a stone instead. She tucked her chin, kicked the skiff's belly, and rose where air lived. Someone shouted her name. Hands reached. Ace's hand reached too, toward her throat. Lilia did not give him her throat. She gave him her palm, a seamstress's palm, scarred with pricked needles and burned kisses from kettles, strong from oars. She set it between his shoulder and the river. She pushed. He slipped. The chain caught him again, a judge refusing to be charmed. He coughed and spat and cursed, the words came out like old nails. The sheriff's men grabbed Ace's coat and hauled him onto the plank, boots sliding, curses sliding too. Myra's hands pulled Lilia up by the armpits and set her on the landing like a treasure you don't know you've been missing until it arrives. Aunt Bet pressed a towel, the good one saved for births and deaths, into her hands. H.H. hovered with shackles no one had yet allowed him to use. Enough theater, the sheriff said, breath pulled into iron. Cuff him. The click said more than the pistol had. Chains, when earned honestly, make a different sound. Asa lay on his side, spitting water and promises. He turned and fixed Lilia with eyes that tried to build a gallows in her skull. You'll hang, he whispered. We all hang, Aunt Bet answered. Some by the neck, some by the truth. The walk to town might have been a parade if anyone had wanted to play music. No one did. The big house shut its shutters as the line formed, sheriff at the front, deputies flanking their prize, H.H. strutting now and then until the sheriff coughed and he remembered his place. Behind them came Reverend Wicks, eyes bright with the thought of sermons he hadn't earned, and then the people from the quarters, not trailing, not leading, walking. Lilia walked beside Mira and Aunt Bet and Tansy. The baby slept, wrist cuff warm against Tansy's skin. Rain had rinsed the road clean, the mud took their steps without argument. The river ran parallel, low talk at their left shoulder. Wagons rolled past, owners craning necks at the sight of a white man in irons and black women walking like a fact. In town, the courthouse smelled like old breath and new paint. A clerk with hair parted like a textbook took statements and stacked them the way a child stacks blocks, carefully, without understanding what the tower means. The sheriff locked Asa in a cell whose bars had never expected their kind of visitor. H.H. posted himself by the door like a signature. Lilia stood in the corner and felt the room try to arrange her into furniture. She refused. When the clerk asked for her name, she gave it plain. When he asked for a mark, she signed, not the full name she used at night when she was alone with numbers, but not the X the room offered either. She wrote Lilia on the line and watched the clerk watch the letters exit her hand like doves. You read? He asked, amazed as a boy encountering thunder the first time his father cries. I listen, she said. The sheriff read the bill of sale found in the safe, the one with issue of house, and his face did what a face does when it has to learn a new language while speaking the old one. He pronounced the words flat and then looked up at Asa, who stopped spitting long enough to show a little smile meant only for Lilia. Do you claim that child? The clerk asked, fumbling the old casework into new drawers. I claim nothing that claimed me first, Lilia said. I claim breath and the right to keep my body where God put it. Reverend Wicks cleared his throat. Powerful words, he said, trying to catch them in his hat. Powerful. Aunt Bet glanced sideways at him until his collar felt tight. The afternoon lay down on the town like a wet quilt. Men came and read the paper on the courthouse door and pretended not to be glad the name on it was not theirs. Women came and stood with their baskets on their hips like shields. The magistrate, called in from a bigger town, did not arrive. Word had it he was waiting on a cousin's advice or a bribe, depending on which door you stood near. Toward dusk, a whisper dressed itself as a rumor, men from the marsh side riding in with thoughts about how to unmake law. Lilia felt the air tense, a quilt pulled too tight. The sheriff posted his deputy at the back door. H.H. flared his coat over the butt of his gun. Reverend Wicks prayed loud enough to hide his fear behind piety's curtains. Mira leaned against the wall and looked bored. "Let them come," she murmured. "We've fed storms before." Tansy hummed to the baby. Aunt Bet stitched a small rip in the towel, each pull a thread a verse. Night dripped through the town eaves. Lanterns popped awake along the main street. Hoofbeats clattered, then spread into uneven thunder. Men in coats the color of mud, faces shadowed by the hats men wore when they hoped to be mistaken for night, swung down from horses and swaggered toward the courthouse. Their talk was the kind that grows in the dark under old boards. "Don't do this," the sheriff told them, hands open, gun holstered. "You know me, and I know you." "That's the trouble," their leader drawled. "You forgot your place, Ed." He slid his eyes over the people standing behind the sheriff and stopped at Lilia with a look used on things men don't think will look back. She looked back. He flinched a half-inch, enough for courage to hang itself on a nail and wait. "Go home," Reverend Wicks called, and for once his voice did not reach for applause. "All of you. We have papers. We have due order. We have." "Shut your mouth, Alton," the leader snapped. "You preach on Sundays. The rest of the week belongs to men who have to make a living." Aunt Bet made a sound like a laugh that remembered funerals. "You boys come to steal a man out of the law's own pocket?" "We come to keep property from being spoiled," another answered, and the word property slid across the street toward Lilia like a blade. Mira moved before the men did, which is how survival works. She crossed to the sheriff, the picture of a woman bringing a man his supper. "Ed," she said, friendly as pie, "you want coffee?" Without waiting, she pushed past him into the little hall toward the rear. 2 breaths later a back window cracked open and children spilled out like marbles, racing the alley to the church where the bell rope hung. The bell began to ring. It didn't toll doom. It called chores. It called supper. It called fire bucket lines and births and wash day. It called what a town cannot name without choking, itself. Men paused, confused by the familiarity of a sound they meant to own but had never truly fed. The sheriff took those 2 heartbeats and used them to move. He ushered people inside, slammed the doors, slid the bench against them. H.H. slow, but not entirely useless, banged a shutter closed. The men outside cussed. One fired a shot into the air because air never testifies. "Bring Whitford out," the leader yelled. "Ain't no paper says a white man belongs in a cage where he stopped, because the word he wanted would have earned him more trouble than pleasure in front of the reverend's parishioners." "Bring him yourself," Lilia shouted back, surprising even her own lungs. "If you can read, you'll find the latch." Laughter hopped around the room, small and bright. The door thudded under a shoulder. The bench jumped. The sheriff braced a foot against it. "We're not a fort," he grunted. "We can't do this all night." "Then don't," Aunt Bet said. "Do it till the river remembers and the road does the rest." Asa laughed in his cell, a sound like coins hitting a church plate. "You're all going to wish you drowned me." "Wishes make poor boats," Lilia told him. She went to the bars and faced him, the candlelight learning his angles. "Look at me," she said, and he did, because habit is a kind of shackle too. "You planted yourself inside people as if they were fields," she said. "You called it fruit when it was rot. You wrote a book and pretended it was weather. This ends." "It ends when I say," he hissed. "Say it, then," she replied. "Listen to how little it weighs." He spat. It hit the floor, cheap water. Outside, the bell kept calling. Doors opened up and down the street. Not men with guns, not exactly. Women with brooms. Boys with buckets. Old men with walking sticks carved by grandsons. They came because the bell said the town was the thing at risk, and even a town that lies to itself carries a small kernel that can still blush. The men in the hats saw their audience change shape and lost a mouthful of bravado. The leader pointed at the church. "Shut that racket." "Come shut it yourself," a child yelled, and ran. He took a step and tripped on a bucket someone slid under his boot. "You hear it?" Aunt Bet asked, eyes on Lilia though she meant everyone. "That's the rope on the recross. That's the other side hearing you walk." The night stretched, every minute put weight on the door. The sheriff's arm trembled. Mira fetched him coffee that wasn't there, which is the same thing when a woman like Mira hands you a cup. The crowd outside began to melt, not from fear or conviction but from boredom and weather and the sudden thought of wives who didn't like fools. "Time," the sheriff panted. "We need to move time." "Then move him," Lilia said, nodding at Asa. "Now." While nobody knows which story they were supposed to believe. H blinked. "Move him where?" "Someplace that isn't yours," Aunt Bet said. "And isn't his." Reverend Wicks squared his shoulders. "The church has a root cellar no one but God visits." He looked proud and then caught himself. "I mean, just for the night." The sheriff weighed two kinds of risk and chose the one that made him more a man in the morning. "Deputy," he barked. "Keys." Asa stood on the far side of the bars, sudden still. Fear walked into his eyes on soft feet. "You wouldn't dare." "Daring is what you call it when people you counted wrong decide to count themselves," Lilia said. They moved him quick. Shackles, coat thrown over his shoulders, hat jammed low to keep his face from being easily sold to the dark. The deputy took the alley with Tansy at his side because no one reads a woman carrying a baby as an escort for justice. Mira walked ahead, broom in hand like a flag of ordinary. Aunt Bet brought up the back, humming that tune with no notes. Lilia walked beside Asa, not touching him, matching his step to teach herself he no longer dictated the rhythm of her breath. The church opened like a mouth planning to sing. The root cellar had a door hidden behind stacks of hymnals and blankets for winter funerals. They tucked Asa inside with a lantern and the hymnals and the smell of old oak. The sheriff set a chair on the door and sat down. "Sleep," he told Asa. "You'll wake when a magistrate can tell the town why it's ashamed." "You'll be dead," Asa whispered upward. "Not if the bell keeps tolling," Aunt Bet said. The bell tolled until midnight, then slowed, then stopped, not because fear ended but because it learned to breathe between its own beats. People drifted home. The night softened. Rain began again, light as apology. Lilia sat on the church step and let the sky wash the river out of her hair. Mira dozed against the doorframe, broom across her knees like a sleeping dog. Tansy hummed against the baby's crown. Reverend Wicks, to his credit, fetched blankets without asking anyone to thank him. "Tomorrow," he asked, small in his own house. "Tomorrow," Lilia said, "we read his books out loud." They did. Morning brought a magistrate with damp cuffs and a look that said someone had used the word scandal near his breakfast. The courthouse filled with people who had been told for years that reading was a luxury and lying a profession. Lilia stood at a table with the ledgers and the bill of sale and the list called Quiet Matters. She read. Her voice did not ornament. It laid each word down like a brick in a path, and people walked it. Names, real ones, rose out of initials like bones washed out by storm. Tansy's boy became a person who could be reclaimed. Aunt Bet's cousin was called a conspirator by a man who had been one longer and with worse consequences. H.H. tried to hide behind his badge and found, to his astonishment, that paper does not block bullets of shame. Asa watched from a chair, shackled, hair damp and pride souring. He interrupted once and the magistrate looked at him over spectacles with a dryness that could wilt a man. "You'll have counsel," the magistrate said. "For now, you have ears." By noon, the town had two crowds, the ones who shifted foot to foot as each ledger line tied a knot around their neighbor's decision to look away, and the ones who stood still because this was the first time the air did not punish them for using it. At noon, too, a woman from the city arrived with a small retinue and 2 clear eyes. H stood up straighter. "Mother," he said, and the room tipped toward a silence that liked itself. She was not delicate, she was honed. She stepped up to the table, read the bill of sale, and then slapped her son with a look that unaged him to his bad summer. "You fool," she said, low and lethal. "Law is a house. If you let filth in, it belongs to you." She turned to Lilia and inclined her head, not enough to be a bow, enough to be a recognition. The magistrate cleared his throat. "There will be trial," he said. "In open court. There will be confiscation of ledgers pending evidence. There will be guardianship placed for certain children." He looked at Tansy. "Temporarily with the church. Permanently," he glanced at Reverend Wicks as if looking for a man and not a pulpit. "Permanently," Lilia said softly, "with their mothers." The magistrate's mouth did a strange thing in a courthouse, it smiled without condescension. "We'll see what the law says," he said, which in the right mouth means I will lean on it until it says something better than it did yesterday. That night the quarters felt like someone had opened a window in a room whose air had been sleeping. People spoke in voices that sounded like they belonged to themselves. Mira made stew with a spice she'd hidden for celebrations of no reason. Aunt Bet sat with a cup of molasses water and named the day a stitch you mind until it holds. Lilia walked to the river. It moved in the dark. Water never applauds. It does not punish either. It works. She set her hand on the piling where the iron ring had screamed and felt the wood remember. "Thank you," she told the ring, and the ring, being iron taught by use, said nothing and everything. Footsteps behind her were careful and known. Tansy came with the baby, whose cuff Lilia unstitched gently, sliding the onion skin paper back into her own pocket. "He's ours," Tansy said, "not to claim but to bless." "Yours," Lilia repeated. "But not the last. We have more cuffs to open. More chains to close," Tansy said, and her voice surprised them both. Days sketched themselves into weeks that could have been seasons if anyone had dared look that far. The trial date set itself like bread does on a warm stove. Men came forward who had been poor enough to be cruel and decided to try being honest instead. Women wrote names on scraps and pinned them behind their hearts. Children learned that bells can be rung for more than fires. Reverend Wicks discovered that listening makes him less tired than speaking. Ace's lawyers came with city dust and polished vowels. They called Lilia many words without using her name. They tried to turn ledgers back into opinions. They tried to sow doubt in fields that had learned to examine their own soil. The magistrate leaned on the law. H.H.'s mother leaned on her son. Aunt Bet leaned on the railing and taught patience by example. Mira leaned on the back wall with a pan of cornbread waiting to turn into a celebration or a solace, depending on how the day wanted to end. When the day in court arrived, a skylight clean linen, air that didn't pretend to be anyone's, the room filled with bodies that had taught themselves to hold more than fear. Asa sat at the defendant's table with his hair obedient and his jaw teacher stern. Lilia took the stand. The lawyers circled. They asked questions that believed answers were decorations. Lilia gave them work instead. She described the safe. She described the ledger's columns. She described the chain as a question the river asked and to which a man gave the wrong answer. She did not speak the night's ugliest words. The room knew them without being fed. The jury left and returned with something heavier than a verdict, a beginning. Guilty on counts the law deigned to name. Whisper guilty on the ones it did not yet know how to say. The magistrate set his gavel down like a gentler kind of hammer and sentenced Asa to years that might turn him into someone capable of feeling them. "Does it change what he did?" a man asked outside, anger and hope making cousins of each other and confusing his mouth. "No," Lilia said. "It changes what we will do next." Next looked like work, the good kind. The kind that turns numbers into food and stitching into maps and maps into roads that do not end at riverbanks. Lilia began to teach letters at night, not as rebellion but as craft. Mira taught measurements that could build a table and a life. Aunt Bet taught the stitch you make when two pieces of cloth do not want to belong to each other but must. Reverend Wicks learned to sweep pews without being asked. The big house remained on its hill, windows squeezed small. It would either rot or repent. Lilia did not volunteer to be its conscience. She visited once, stood in the study, and looked at the desk that had been an altar to numbers and men. She did not touch it. She turned and left. On a thin morning at Summer's Throat, a packet boat came down the chop tank with a whistle like an old woman's greeting. On it, a cousin of Aunt Bet's and 3 people whose names had been initials. They carried papers that recognized their existence, and scars that didn't ask for recognition, and songs with new verses. The town met them at the landing, the river clapped in its way against pilings. As they disembarked, a figure at the back of the packet paused, hat low, coat too heavy for weather. H.H. straightened, hand moving to the comfort of metal. The figure lifted its chin and revealed a face Lilia knew the way one knows a stone underfoot on a path you've walked 100 times, Ace's cousin from Annapolis, the one with federal airs. He smiled like a magistrate about to ask if anyone has considered the consequences of justice. Miss, he began, and stopped, because the name he wanted to use did not belong to him. Lilia, she supplied, because sometimes you must teach a man the word he will use to insult you so that when he says it, it blesses instead. He tipped his hat. You've stirred a fine hornet's nest, he said. It was already buzzing, she replied. We only opened the window. His gaze moved past her to the crowd, to Mira and Tansy and Aunt Bet and H.H.'s mother and the sheriff and a minister who had learned the taste of listening and a child with a bell rope callus. He took in the skiff at the landing, its ribs oiled, its iron ring polished by use. He sighed a politician's sigh. Washington is listening, he warned. Men with pens have ways of fixing mistakes that don't look fixed up close. Then let them come closer, Aunt Bet said, and her voice made the crowd's spine remember itself. The cousin's smile thinned. Careful, he said, then caught himself. No. Not careful. You don't need my counsel. He looked at Lily again. But you may need my watchfulness. There are those who think justice is a disease. Let them bring their medicine, Mira said. We'll test it. He touched his hat, half in respect, half in worry, and went up the road toward the hotel where men like to feel important. That evening Lilia sat by the river with the skiff tied proper knots to proper iron. Tansy came and Mira and Aunt Bet. The baby, heavier now, batted at a moth that did not consider itself prey. The world smelled like sun stepping out of its shoes. Lilia read aloud from a tattered almanac, moon phases and tide tables and the simple miracle that numbers, when not weaponized, could tell you where the water would be when you needed it. Teach me the one about the knot again, Tansy said. Lilia showed her. Left over right, under and through, right over left, trust and pull. It holds because both parts give, she said. It holds because the rope knows it wants to be a single thing more than 2 ends. Like us, Mira murmured. Like us, Aunt Bet agreed. A breeze lifted off the water and brought with it the smell of creosote and rail and a rumor, new men in town, unfamiliar hats, questions bought with someone else's coin. The ripple reached their bench and dissolved like sugar in tea. Storm? Tansy asked, not looking worried, only curious. Every road changes the next road, Aunt Bet said. Walk anyway. They did. Through harvest and first frost and a winter that considered kindness and then allowed small mercies. Through trials not just in court but in kitchens and fields and bedrooms where men and women had to learn how to let the old rules die without burying themselves with them. Through a spring that set iris mouths open again at the marsh edge, yellow tongues tasting the weather like news. On a bright Sunday when the bell rang because it felt like singing, not warning, Lilia stood before a half-circle of children with slate boards and patience. She wrote letters that had once been forbidden, and the children copied them with tongues out between their teeth, concentrating. She wrote river and law and bread and ring and chain and stitch and Lilia. She read each one out loud like a benediction. A shadow fell across the doorway. The room lifted its head as one thing. H.H. stood there, hat in hand, badge shining too honest for its owner. He looked awkward as a man in a kitchen. "Messenger from Washington," he said. "Paper with new signatures." He hesitated. "I came here first." Lilia took the document. She read it in the light of the doorway. Words about federal oversight, about seizures and reforms, about protections that smelled good on paper and would starve if not fed by hands like theirs. She nodded slowly. "Does it help?" a child asked. "It might," Lilia said. "If we read it to the river." "Then read." Aunt Bet's voice floated from the back pew, where she always sat like a weight the world could tie to and not drift. Lilia walked to the landing. The town followed, because that's what towns do when they remember they exist. She stood by the iron ring and read the new law out loud. The river listened. It does not nod, it does not praise. It remembers. When she finished, she folded the paper and handed it back to H.H., who looked the way a boy looks when he is not sure if he has done enough to keep his mother proud another day. "We'll hold you to it," she said. "I know," he answered, and for the first time his badge looked like clothing and not a costume. A gull cried. The baby, no longer a baby, laughed at the sound like it was a joke only children understand. Mira announced cornbread. Reverend Wicks fetched a bucket with no sermon attached. Men who had once changed the subject when Law sat down beside them asked how to spell their daughters' names. Toward evening, as shadows lengthened into long, forgiving sentences, a rider came fast on the road from the mill. He wore no hat, his hair hard with sweat. He slid off his horse near the landing and clutched the rail the way people do when they are about to drag a new fact into a calm room. From the east, he panted. 3 men. Guns and a writ, they say. Bigger than the last. Looking for the woman who tied a ring to a river and a man to a truth. His eyes found Lilia. The crowd stirred. Not fear, precisely. Muscle remembering it can clench. Mira set down the pan. Aunt Bet stood. Tansy lifted her chin. The sheriff reached for a key instead of a gun. Lilia rose. She did not touch the skiff. She touched the iron ring, just once, as if reminding it she was still herself. "We have more roads to walk," she said to the town. "And more ropes to choose." She turned her eyes toward the cut in the marsh where the creek bent like a question that needed many answers. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of rail and government and things that had not yet learned the names of the people they planned to own. "Then we'll do what we did last time," Aunt Bet said. "We'll make a scene and a trap and a song." "And a ledger," Mira added, smiling in a way that made men examine their portions. "And a bell," the children chorused. Lilia dropped her hand from the ring and faced the road. The light caught the water and turned it into a promise. She felt the stitch of fear and passed the needle through it. She breathed the breath of a woman who has learned that survival is a craft, defiance is a strategy, consequence a reckoning, and leadership a dignity you don't ask another to lend. Somewhere beyond the bend, boots ate distance. Somewhere behind her, a town squared its shoulders. The river exhaled. Lilia smiled, small, fierce. "All right," she said to the day, to the riders, to the old law bucking under new harness. "Come see if iron remembers you, too. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications."